Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. Welcome to Junior's Restaurant, Times Square, New York City. Yes, for those watching on Paramount Plus, CBS News 24/7, a little bit of stubble, no makeup, a little raggedy hair because this is November 7th. We're post-election and I'm a little bleary-eyed if my voice cracks. It's been a lot of talking this week, but we're gonna go through the election. The election's been held, it was decisive, concessions have been given. We're going to pick apart some of the underlying themes and data. And to help me do that, Anthony Salvanto, who has a very elaborate title. Just know this. He is the best and most important data manager and pollster CBS News has ever had. Period. And Ed O'Keefe, political correspondent and senior White House correspondent.
Last I checked.
There we go. Gentlemen, it's great to see you. Good morning. Happy to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words.
And what I said a minute ago about Anthony is a compliment. It's also a fact. Our CBS survey data was dead on. What the voters told us they were most interested in and concerned about ran throughout this entire election year and was also dead on. So Anthony, take yourself a victory lap.
Well, look, it's all about listening to people. It's all about the voice. And one of the things that came out of this is we said all along it was tight and it was close. But what was interesting to me as things unfolded on election night is that you saw Donald Trump do exactly what he had to do to break each of those states his way, because they will all land within the margin of error, right? But the consistency of that is a big takeaway. In other words, he hit his vote targets. He swung, and we'll talk about this, but he swung those areas not just that were already red, but a little bit of swing even in areas that were blue. Obviously, he had his issues front and center for people. So that sort of consistency across was one of the big takeaways for me.
And Ed, your general big picture takeaways thus far. There's going to be a lot of data to sift, a lot of granularity to go through, but your big picture thoughts as we sit here November 7th at Junior's.
Which, by the way, very cool to finally get in here because we walk by it all the time going to the office and finally get to partake. What I think was most striking is we know we talk about how it's a 50-50 country, things are evenly divided, and they certainly were in the battleground states. But what you saw, and if you have any doubt about the power of the Trump coalition and what he's built, the movement as he likes to call it, it manifested itself in places like New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, where you notice the margins were much closer than they normally
are. Dramatically, yes.
Like high, low single digits in New Jersey and New York.
Right.
Low single digits in Connecticut. He brought out the people that agree with him, not just in Michigan and Wisconsin and North Carolina like he needed to, but all across the country, which will send shivers up the spines of those Democratic governors in the Northeast and other parts of this country who are facing re-election or thinking about their futures in their states and across the country and realize, I can't ignore this because it exists here too, even if we thought Republicans in the Midwest or the Northeast were different.
That dynamic played out in Virginia, 10-point Biden win, 5-point Harris win.
You and I were at the decision desk all night, and one of the things that was notable, if folks looked at that map at, say, 9 p.m., 10 p.m., right. And we knew those states, you mentioned Virginia, New Jersey, we knew they were all leaning blue, but why weren't they projected yet?
Right.
Because there was this overall uniform swing, and if you go back to the pre-election polling, unpack that word close a little bit, when we were talking about an even national race, what you sort of stood up and took notice was, well, wait a second, that means the other states, the big ones, the New Yorks, the New Jerseys, the Virginias, are all looking a little more like the battleground states, just a little more. And that's one of the things that manifested itself.
And Ed, to that point, the Trump campaign kept telling us that over and over. Yeah. He is polling stronger than you realize. And this is going to manifest itself. And we were doubtful about that. There's no better way to start your day, ladies and gentlemen, than cheesecake at Junior's. I'm just going to lay that down as a fact. Ed has Oreo cheesecake. I have carrot cake cheesecake. Anthony's going slightly more traditional with a Western omelet. To each his own.
Well, look, this is a great place for omelets, number one. And number two,
yes.
After a stretch through election night, I fell asleep last night for the first time in
first
however
time in
many
48 hours.
Skipped dinner, so this
Yes.
this is my catch-up.
You're going to catch back up.
Exactly.
But the Trump campaign told us this, and they were proven correct.
Sorry, they
Yes.
most definitely were. And
it was
remember-
obvious to them. They were not hesitant about that. They were
they weren't.
declarative about that.
And the issue, I think, for many of us who've covered Trump world is there's being right and then there's being sort of cocky about it.
Right, and there's never
There's
any,
a history
and there
of
is
that.
never ever, ladies and gentlemen, any shortage of self-confidence bordering on overconfidence in Trump world.
Which is
Everything is
why-
always victorious. Everything is always supreme. Every adjective that is on the upside is always deployed. So you, over time, wonder if that's just the modality, that's just their language, or they're actually looking at something real. In this case, they were looking at something
They
real.
were. They absolutely were. And your scenarios pointed out it will happen for him if he can drag out more men, which is exactly what he did. And that was a theory that existed. That was a theory Democrats knew about. And I suspected in the closing days talking to them, because there were no confident Democrats to be found anywhere in the country. And you would ask them, have you seen on the ground whatever it is Republicans claim to be doing? Some said yes, they did in Pennsylvania and out in Arizona. The campaign itself was dismissing what the Trump team was doing because they normally
Right.
husband that kind of stuff and had outsourced it to Elon Musk's
We're going to
PAC
get into
and
that
other
more in segment
organizations.
2, yes.
So there was deep skepticism about
Yep.
the possibility this would happen, but it certainly
Anthony,
happened
talk about
in a big
men.
way.
Well, we talk about men through the context of the gender gap that we talked about.
And it's really important that three guys talk about men. I just want everyone to understand that.
On that subject, we're experts.
Well, look, we knew we'd see a gender gap, okay, and we did see a gender gap. But the fact is, number one, the men vote towards Trump was composed not just by habitual voters, but to your point, there were people who came out to vote just for Donald Trump, is kind of the simplest way to say it. And you can see that in the exit polls, I think, and you can see that in the ticket splitting, and the fact that he would get more votes than anyone else, including other Republicans on the ticket. And so to your point, Ed, the campaign was able to activate those lower propensity voters, many of them men, not necessarily always engaged in politics,
Right.
not even necessarily framing things like the culture battles.
And certainly
in
would not
political
think of
terms.
themselves as all day, everyday Republicans or even all day, everyday conservatives.
Nope.
They're all day, everyday, a lot of other things. And on this night, on this day, they were for Trump.
Right. I mean, before the election, people were talking about the bro vote, right? That sort of tangentially interested in politics type of voter. That's why he was going on podcasts. He was trying to reach, around traditional media, all of that. So that definitely did seem to play out. And that doesn't know of geography. So back to the top, right? It's not that they all live in one place. It's that that's everywhere.
And Ed, I want to start this conversation. We'll carry it over after the break. But the other thing the Trump campaign argued, and I agreed with them on this throughout, the fundamentals favored former President Trump. People were displeased with inflation.
Yep.
They had identified for 2 or 3 years immigration as a serious and rising concern. And there was this sort of world on fire sense of insecurity. 30 seconds, start that conversation. We'll pick it up on the other side.
Well, I think our colleague Jill Schlesinger, who tracks business and personal finance stuff, said it best the other day, is there's been no government around the world that hasn't suffered in recent years for inflationary pressures and economic downturn. Japan, the United Kingdom, various European governments have seen similarities. Why wouldn't it happen in the biggest one of them all? So that is a big element of this that both President Biden and Vice President Harris failed to, fully sell the voters, that they understood and they were trying to fix it. And ultimately, that's something that isn't entirely under their control.
Ed O'Keefe, like me, once in print, now a trained broadcast professional, hits that 30-second mark expertly. When we get back, we'll continue that conversation and dig in more to this idea about what kind of voter mobilization works and what doesn't. Segment 2 of the Takeout from Juniors coming your way in just a second.
And if you think about it in their terms, that's an extension of the pandemic. Inflation is a direct extension of the pandemic.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Welcome back to juniors. And again, I just want to reiterate, carrot cake, cheesecake, a very good way to start your day, especially if you're a juniors. Ed O'Keefe, Anthony Salvanto. Ed, let's continue this conversation. No one likes inflation. No government can easily make a political argument that succeeds in the face of inflationary concerns. But it seems to me it ran deeper. There were 2 or 3 areas where Democrats just didn't understand exactly how ticked off voters were and assumed they could get by on those issues and elevate their concerns about the future of democracy, reproductive health care more broadly.
Yeah, and I think this is the final election where you're going to see politicians using, at least for a while, politicians using Bureau of Labor Statistics, Federal Reserve decisions as part of their arguments. They understand now that this is all about vibes, and it's all about sort of emotional, mental reaction to what's going on. And you can only use that data so much before voters start to tune it out at this point.
Well, you think about the experience of voters. You have to go back to the early 80s to find an inflationary period that
Correct.
people would have gone through. So you don't have much of the voting population who
Right.
has a personal memory of what that is like, right? So
And what happens when you come out of one?
and what happens when you come out of one. So when you get to your point about the BLS statistics, we would ask in the polling all the time, what measures do you use to gauge the economy inflation? And people would always say personal experience. And then you look at the difference there between what people were comparing. Normally in an election, we go, are you better off under this administration or the last? We have a political demarcation. But voters pushed back on that in our polling and said, no, we're comparing this to our lives pre and post pandemic.
Right.
And they're looking at their financial lives as where they were before the pandemic and then after it, and they still felt like they were upended.
Is there a larger takeaway, Anthony, from the data about the whole post-pandemic realities as people felt them and things that they wanted to see changed based on their memory of the pandemic?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the top of this. We talk about the kinds of voters who swung. You draw the line between the folks who didn't have the ability or the luxury, some would say, to stay home during the pandemic and do Zoom meetings.
Yep.
They were still out there, they were still going to work, they were still having to do those jobs. And then after that,
Or they had their small business closed.
or they had their small business
longer
closed, or
than
their
they were
restaurant
comfortable with,
closed.
or longer they thought was rational, or their friends did, or their family did. They knew someone
Right.
who felt the heavy thumb or restrictive nature of these public health policies, and they felt voiceless.
Yes, and then on top of that, right, you've got the inflation, back to that, often hit those folks at least as hard, if not harder, than it hit others, right? They're working class folks, they're small business owners, all those folks. So it sort of had this magnified effect, and if you think about it in their terms, that's an extension of the pandemic. Inflation is a direct extension of the pandemic. So all of that put together makes that then it shows up in the demos on the exit poll.
And Ed, I believe there will be, of course, many summaries of this election, many moments captured, but I have to believe that one of the words that will be held on to by the Biden White House that did not work and that aggravated all these underlying problems was to refer to inflation as transitory.
What the hell does that mean?
First of all, what does it mean? And secondly, it carries a whiff of indifference or elite estrangement from what people are concerned
I
about.
wouldn't even say it's a whiff.
Okay.
I would say most people said that is. That was a complete failure. It was Clinton used to say, I feel your pain, right? There was a sense that Biden didn't feel your pain. He was just hugging his charts and graphs and saying, but look, people, everything will be fine. Just give it 6 more weeks. Well, there are people out there who couldn't afford 6 more weeks or 6 more months or a year more.
And it wasn't 6 weeks.
Right.
And it wasn't 3 months. And
Right.
it wasn't 6 months. It
Right.
persisted for a very long time. Now,
And still does for a lot of people.
yes. Now, the great underlying truth is President-elect Trump comes into a very good American economy.
Absolutely.
A really good American
Once again
economy.
inherits-
Which I believe, starting on January 20th, 2025, he will begin declaring it's a great American economy
Absolutely.
because I'm here now.
Right, right. But once again, he's
it's better than
inheriting-
he describes it, but still those underlying concerns were propulsive for his campaign.
Yes, and that's what will drive Democrats nuts, is because you saw former President Obama go out and say the only reason his economy was good was because of what I set him up to do. George H.W. Bush did the same thing with Clinton. You know, like, it's the last guy who deserves the credit, but he's no longer running. So now what Democrats are likely to do is now track everything that he starts to do. Will he implement tariffs? Will he implement those tax cuts? Will there no longer be taxes on tips? And how does that then wear on the economy by the time 2026 and 2028?
Anthony, what did the data tell us for the last couple of years about immigration?
It's not just a factor, but it plays across many levels of concerns, by which I mean there are economic concerns that come out of it, right? It's resources, it's how many folks are getting which public data, public assistance. Then there's the secondary concern, or the second concern, especially among folks on the Republican MAGA base, concerned about the cultural impact. They say, in their words, immigration and immigrants
And if you
don't
don't have a
contribute
border,
to
you
society.
don't have a nation.
You don't have a border, you don't have a nation.
They want a nation.
Well, right, and the cultural change, the demographic change, quite frankly, that it brings, and they outwardly say they don't think that's positive for the United States. So it plays on that level as well. And then put that back in context with what we were just talking about with the inflationary period. Here are folks who are themselves up against it and struggling, and then they're seeing more, if in their minds, effort or assistance or anything to say, reach out to others. So in their mind, it strikes on a fairness chord as well. And again, I'm voicing what they told me, but that's how they perceive it. And so it played on all those levels and therefore had a wide impact.
And Ed, I want you to evaluate something that brought this migrant situation to the doorstep of democratic cities. The governor of Texas began using private funds to bus migrants from Texas to Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Denver, and elsewhere. At first, there was a sense of recoiling, like, oh, this is a stunt. It was maybe a stunt, but it was also a way of explaining in a very vivid way what Texas was going through. And I think that was, if not the most important development in broadening the conversation about immigration and the pressures that those seeking asylum or refugee status in Texas were feeling in other parts of the country.
Yeah, no, I think Trump will owe Governor Abbott for the rest of their lives for that move, whether it was intentional or whether it was to just make a point to those blue states that you don't understand, well, now you do. Because overnight, it caused the kind of widespread resource crunch and panic in the streets, literally in the streets, that Abbott argued was going on in Texas, though not to the extent that it was covered once it reached not only big cities, frankly, but also media capitals.
Yes.
I mean, part of what Abbott did was by literally putting it down the street from major newsrooms in this city.
Right.
It became front of mind for people who don't take the time to go to Texas or Arizona or California to see the border and to see those towns that are not overwhelmed and consumed and racked by immigrant-fueled crime, but definitely see it much more than people might otherwise in other parts of the country. And the pressure that Mayor Adams and Mayor Lightfoot, now Mayor Johnson in Chicago, and governors in the other states were putting on
Mayor
a White
Bowser
House
in District of
that
Columbia.
refused to take their calls and give them much more assistance was, again, denial of what was going on, and I think contributed to the fact that you're seeing tighter margins in these blue states.
Anthony, I know you want to jump in, but I got to hit a break, and I will very much reward you with that eagerness to jump in when we come on the other side of the break, continue the conversation about election 2024, the big data points, the big issues, what we got right, what we got wrong. Basically, at this table, nothing got wrong. I'm just kidding about that. Segment 3 of the Takeout in just 1 second.
What were we hearing from people before this? If that happens, I will not believe, I will not understand my country, I will not understand why people feel that way. And I want to be like, well, then you're not asking enough questions yourself or doing enough listening.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Anthony, you wanted to jump in, please. I know. Let me have a moment for the omelet. We don't want to have any digestion issues or Heimlich issues here. I'm not a professional. Don't pretend to be one. There you go. You're ready to go. Jump in.
Endorsing the home fries here. Look, there's a thread through everything we've been talking about, which is abstraction versus practical or reality, which is to say there's immigration, and Democrats often argue it helps the country. It's they want to talk about humanitarian efforts and all of that. But then there's the practical reality of what happens and when you're talking about it comes to your town. The same thread runs through, we're talking about inflation. There's what many people feel like is an abstraction on the BLS charts and the economy. And then there's the practical reality of you standing in line at the grocery store and having to decide, is it eggs or is it meat? Right? So that's the difference and the distinction.
Well, and you made a good point last night, too, that when we were having dinner in another setting, that part of the reason the restaurant bill has gone up is the effect of wage increases is finally rubbing off on customers.
And this is an interesting phenomenon. One little piece of micro data from the election on Tuesday. As many of you may remember, I'm a graduate of the University of Missouri. In the state of Missouri, Trump won big. Republican candidate for Senate, Josh Hawley, won big. Republican candidate for governor, won big. Missouri also passed an abortion rights referenda and voted to raise the minimum wage. Those two things, raising the minimum wage, protecting access to abortion more than the state legislature had, do not fit with the identified agenda of Donald Trump, Josh Hawley, or the Republican candidate who prevailed easily for governor. And yet it happened. Anthony, pull that apart for us if you can.
The ticket splitting theme goes beyond Missouri in terms of abortion, right? Even though it didn't pass, the abortion referenda ran ahead of Kamala Harris in Florida, right? It ran ahead of Kamala Harris in Arizona as of this taping, right? So in state after state, you saw that. The reasons for that is, number one, there are plenty of Republicans who will vote for abortion rights, who will vote for reproductive rights. We see that in the polling all throughout. A lot of Republicans don't think it should be illegal. In fact, the ones who think it should be illegal in all cases is a very small percentage, although they have perhaps outsized influence in party primaries, et cetera, right? So that kind of crossover, the difference there is notable, like I said, across all the places where it passed, and yet Trump won.
I want to ask you, Anthony, about something that happened the weekend before the election. There was a poll that came out in Iowa. It got a lot of attention from a very accomplished pollster with a impressive track record in caucuses in Iowa and in general election polling. You had a very steady take on what was happening in Iowa that diverged from Ann Selzer's poll, which said Harris could be up by 3 in Iowa. Walk me through why you were more confident about your data and what you think Ann Selzer might have seen that didn't exist.
So the big picture is pollsters, folks at decision desk, you always rely on patterns, consistency of data. There was so much data out there that this was a tight national race, which would be inconsistent with a major shift to the left in Iowa. And so that's where you got to lean, right? That you get one data point or one signal, but the preponderance of evidence is against that. Now, having said that, look, credit to anyone in the arena. Anybody out there trying to measure public opinion, trying to measure the voices and let people tell their stories, I think tip of the cap. That's great. And there, but for the grace of God, like all of us have had our, hits and misses, quite frankly.
Right, because Ann Selzer was more right than the national polls and the Iowa polls in 2016 and 2020.
Yeah. So look, we've all been there, but the point is this: look for the preponderance of evidence, number one, and number two. As we get close to an election, people often process polls through their hearts and not always through an analytic data process, and I understand that. So there were plenty of folks, and I know a lot of folks maybe who are on the left and thinking like, oh, that's a signal, that's a hopeful signal that kind of goes, and look, that happens, like half the country yells at me at the end of every election because it's like the polls go either way, right? Because you're looking at it with your heart, not your head.
How do you do that as a pollster? How do you keep your head and your heart out of it and just focus on the data? Because I got to believe you have friends, neighbors, family who are bugging you all the time, like, it can't be that way, or why are you doing this, and why do you do that? And then you have your own personal experience, but you're being asked to just focus on numbers in an increasingly political world that we live in. You know,
that feels more emotional than ever.
You're gonna go somewhere with the kids, and some guy's gonna stop you, and he'll be talking politics, and you're gonna go to the grocery store, and someone's gonna say something, and that gets inside your head as you look into that. How do you do it? How do you set it aside?
You're gonna go to one of your 7 country clubs, you know.
Usually the person who stops me goes, "Oh, you're on CBS," and I say, "Yes, I am there. Do you know Ed O'Keefe?"
Yeah, whatever. That prick.
You tell that Ed O'Keefe. No, look, the thing I try to say is it's a big country with a lot of voices in it. And all of us increasingly live in silos and listen in silos. And so I say, well, you know what? There's folks out there who disagree with you. And I'm a small channel for their voice. And you know, it's worth paying attention to that, even if you don't necessarily want to.
Isn't it striking how we have more people expressing their opinions, but at the end of this, when you hear the shock or the amazement, you realize that a lot of people are not listening to each other. Or trying to comprehend why. Because what were we hearing from people before this? If that happens, I will not believe, I will not understand my country, I will not understand why people feel that way. And I want to be like, well, then you're not asking enough questions yourself or doing enough listening.
I mean, that silo issue is very real.
Really
we may not
real.
Get to all of it in this episode, but it is something to keep in mind going forward for all of us. Ed, I want to know if you're as surprised as I was that one of the theories of the Harris campaign that access to abortion, reproductive health care writ large, was not a stronger driver and a stronger motivator. Because in some special elections it was, in 2022 it was, in the Virginia legislative races, which were hard fought up and down the state, it was, in referenda it was, and it was outpolling the performance ultimately on those questions, outpolled the polls going in. So it looked like there was a certain potency there. I thought that it would manifest in the first election, presidential election, since the overturning of Roe. And in the main, it simply did not.
Yeah.
I will concede, I was surprised by that.
Which Udall ran a few years ago and lost in Colorado? Was it Mark Udall, the senator, right? And he was running for re-election, and he made almost his entire re-election campaign about abortion rights for whatever reason. And he lost disastrously. And it was a red herring to all Democrats. Like, you cannot just run on this issue because you cannot assume that women will just vote on this issue. And I think this was reinforced by the results here, that while we saw it do very well and see those rights either fortified or expanded in the 10 states, most of the 10 states, and it would have in Florida if they didn't have that 60% threshold.
Yes.
They got the 57 and change, which is why Florida Republicans know the issue will come back and has to come back because it is a popular one to expand abortion rights. It's just that one little fluke in the law, which is what Ohio tried to do a few years ago too, before it passed. So it's there, but it cannot be, and I think this is what Democrats will learn from, the bedrock principle on which you build a campaign, at least a national campaign. When I think a lot of Americans are okay with the idea that there are certain things that get done state by state, right? And I also wonder if voters didn't hear her say, if you elect me, I will restore this, and go, but don't you need Congress for that?
Right.
And Congress can't agree on when to go to lunch. So why are you even promising us something that may not be achievable?
On that?
Right.
Or
So,
are you saying that I'm going to get rid of the filibuster, which I know
Which is
feels
another thing that's
granular, but a
uncomfortable.
lot of people aren't comfortable
Right.
with as just an institutional issue?
Yeah, so it was a gamble. It was something that certainly Democrats understood needed to be discussed and should have been discussed because it is a genuine, urgent concern for a lot of people. I just wonder if someone like Michelle Obama and the speech she gave in Kalamazoo 2 Saturdays ago had been given sooner and in a more public way, if that message might not have resonated faster, because most of that speech is built around telling men why this is an issue, and I'd never seen anyone do it before.
Ed O'Keefe, Anthony Salvanto, we'll be back for segment 4 of the Takeout from Juniors in Times Square in just a moment.
It's not about the crowds or the crowd size. It's about giving a perception to the rest of the audience that there's a movement larger than just politics.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Anthony Salvanto, Ed O'Keefe. Ed, I'm going to give this to you, and then Anthony, I want you to weigh in. We know this to be true in election after election. Celebrities don't win you elections. Surrogates do not win you elections. Before we went to break, you talked about Michelle Obama's speech. Could have been given by Kamala Harris. Could have been taken over, some of it, by Kamala Harris. It wasn't. Down the stretch, and there was already pre-election criticism from some Democrats about this, huge emphasis on big crowds, celebrities, razzmatazz. Your evaluation of that?
It didn't work. But
was that a tell that they were weaker than they should have been on the core fundamentals?
It is now. And I think it's telling that almost instantly everyone who worked on her campaign and those closest to it were pointing out how what she did in 107 days was really impressive. As if to say, you didn't give us enough time, and if we'd had more time, maybe we would have been able to win this thing. And so I think there was an over-reliance on celebrity or on events. Two reasons. One, they needed help drawing people to a woman that was famous but unknown, right? Or is it, yeah. Famous but misunderstood. Like, people know her name, know her face by virtue of being...
High visibility, but not much concrete knowledge.
At all. So why not use Megan Thee Stallion or Bon Iver or Maggie Rogers or the Obamas to drag in a crowd?
Springsteen.
Yeah, and look, we would go to these events, and I know that there were people who only showed up because, Bon Jovi was there. Right? And many would leave quietly, quickly, as soon as she took the stage, because they're like, well, I came for the real reason. I was here, a free concert. Fine. If they had ended up voting for her, then all the better. But I think their argument is we didn't have enough time. We needed to do what we could. The other reason, though, is fundraising. They needed tentpole moments. And there were Biden campaign officials in the spring saying they needed tentpole-like moments to generate fundraising enthusiasm.
Right.
It really works with Democrats, that if there's a date coming or an event coming that you can work towards, the contributions
Anthony, quickly, your thoughts on the question I asked Ed, and I want to put another question to you after you answer that, which is, fundamentally, by what you saw in the data, was this race winnable for Kamala Harris under any set of circumstances?
Okay, so on the crowd, events thing, it's not about the crowds or the crowd size. It's about giving a perception to the rest of the audience that there's a movement larger than just politics, that there's a movement larger that you can be part of. And frankly, that's on either. That's a Trump campaign, that's the Harris campaign. So the celebrities are used as a signal to that. There's this larger cultural connection that people want to feel like they're part of, especially for people who aren't sort of wonks going through each checkpoint of public policy, right? Number one. Number two, was this winnable? Yes, it was, very frankly. I mean, we showed scenarios in which she could have won, and one of them was, you talked a lot about this.
Even with the compressed campaign and everything else.
Yes. Number one, because Trump had a ceiling, especially from folks who said they did not like him personally, right? Number two, because you had seen in 2022, Democrats do well at turning out not necessarily high propensity voters on issues like reproductive rights. So they had that data point thinking, oh, how do we replicate that? Right, number two. And look, number three, you also had the fact that any of these could have broken a different way without that many votes switching, right? So that's what I meant at the top by sort of hitting targets perfectly. It wouldn't have taken that much to flip 2, 3, 4 of those states back the other way.
We're going to get two issues in before we have to go. First, Ed, in our election coverage, as it was clear that the trend lines were demonstrably against Vice President Harris and very unlikely to prevail, one of our political contributors, someone you and I both know well, Joel Payne, said, look, one of the things the Democrats have to understand is independents got off the Biden bus with the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Yeah, it was interesting.
And he said, I think that has to be understood as a very important moment in the Biden presidency. I'd like you to evaluate that.
And I don't think it had necessarily to do with the idea that you were withdrawing from Afghanistan. Because remember, your polling showed us there was support for withdrawing from Afghanistan. Widespread support.
His approval went like that. His overall
And that's when independents broke. Independents had been hanging with Biden, stoutly until that moment,
But
and
did
then
it
they
not
went off.
fall because there were concerns about his management and competency?
Management
right?
and competence.
Not over the issue, but over
Right.
the execution.
Exactly.
So if
because
those
he
kids-
circled the date and said there'll be no problems.
Right.
He was asked in the spring,
Point blank.
will it look like Vietnam? He said, of course not. That's
Of course
absurd.
not. And it looked just like it, if not
If
worse,
not worse.
because there were more cameras. So
Yeah.
it was a huge problem for them. And it coincided with the start of the inflation problem.
Yep.
It
So-
was Afghanistan, inflation, and Joe Manchin telling him to take a hike.
Yep.
Those three things right there in 2021 sapped them.
His measures of confidence dropped along with that, and then they bled over into evaluations of how he was handling the economy and inflation. That was a signal to people, because until then he had been at about 60%, and it was, for the public, well, maybe he's not handling things as well as we thought.
And then a year later, they do slightly better than expected in the midterms, and it went to his head, and he kept running. Because someone should have reminded him, or someone should have stepped in and said, but you told the country you were going to be a transitional figure.
Yep.
You told the country you would pass things off. He didn't do it, and here we are.
Speaking of transition in a different way, if you were a sports fan in the closing weeks of this campaign, watching the World Series or college football or professional football, there was one Trump ad you saw on a loop, which said, she's for them, he's for you. And the underlying issue was transgender rights.
He's for they, them.
He's for they, she's for they, them, he's for you.
Yeah.
Evaluate that, Ed.
It's going to require a little more evaluation, but it reminds me of
Very small population of America for whom this is a preeminent issue, but it is a
Transgender
broader cultural prism.
yeah. And as we were saying, 20 years ago, literally 20 years ago this month, there
Yes.
would have been measures on the ballot.
There were measures on the ballot to ban gay marriage.
Where will
which
we be?
succeeded.
Where will we be in 10, 20 years and look back at those ads and think, well, that made a lot of sense in the short-term political moment, but I can't believe we ran those. Maybe. What was more interesting to me was that Democrats just let it lie and never really felt the need to address it.
Anthony?
One of the strongest correlations in the polling was if you asked people what they felt about gender equality efforts in the United States. A lot of women who said they hadn't gone far enough, and those folks all voted for Harris. But a lot of the folks who said, and this was a lot of men, that they felt those efforts were going too far, overwhelmingly for Trump. There really wasn't a stronger correlation out there.
And it seems to me that on that question, where you stood on that issue was representative of a lot of other cultural concerns that were adjacent or nearby. And that was a more powerful motivator flowing through the electorate than where you were on the future of reproductive health care, which could be a proxy for a lot of other values issues nearby. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, because those cultural things always infuse a presidential election. We spend a lot of time on the particulars of policy this and policy that, but that larger thing is how people evaluate the direction of the country, and people feeling like, well,
In that sense, many Trump voters felt the country was changing too fast in ways they were uncomfortable with. So yes, while they were voting for change, that was represented by Trump, which has a nostalgic flair to it, and they wanted to stop some of the change they were most uncomfortable with. That's it for the show. Please stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial coming to you from Juniors in Times Square.
What incredible that Donald Trump won the city of Dearborn over Kamala Harris. This is a city that is predominantly Arab or Muslim American.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial from Juniors in Times Square. November 7th, we are dissecting the election. We have about 3 minutes, so we're going to do one topic. Ed O'Keefe, Anthony Salvanto are my special guests. Ed, when I traveled around the country and I talked to Trump supporters, in addition to all the other issues we've discussed, they would say the world's on fire. I feel unsafe.
They would. Combining immigration, concerns about Afghanistan, those were reason enough. And I
You
think
encountered in one of the first national correspondents to bring this to television, deep unrest in a very important swing state, Michigan, over the war in Gaza.
And it was incredible that Donald Trump won the city of Dearborn over Kamala Harris. This is a city that is predominantly Arab or Muslim American. The biggest concentration of them in this country. Had been a flashpoint after 9/11 for the concerns about civil liberties and civil rights. Now was a flashpoint in the sort of global response to what's going on in the Middle East, and they held it against her, as they were holding it against the president a year ago. saying, I can't vote for him. Many of them were open to her because they knew that she was driving the president's more public acknowledgement of the humanitarian strife in that region. But then as they listened to her and as her team refused to engage them, would disinvite them, would kick them out of events in and around Detroit, they said, we can't do it. And they withheld,
no primetime messaging during the convention.
And they withheld thousands of votes from her. Probably not enough to flip the state, but certainly contributed to her struggles.
Anthony, what did the data tell you about World on Fire and concerns generally?
For all the focus we do on week-to-week polling, big ideas play out over years. I go back to 2016 when Donald Trump started saying the Iraq War had been a mistake. And a lot of Republicans gasped and said, you can't say that, you can't say that. But don't overlook the impact of that, especially for folks in the MAGA base and others who say, wait a second, we don't want to get involved. Others call it isolationist. We see it permeate ideas like support for aid to Ukraine, etc. That isolationist strain is one of the defining differences between the MAGA base and traditional Republicans. And right now that plays out for a lot of his support.
And you mentioned earlier people's memory of the economy under Trump. They have a memory of the world feeling to them more stable and with America at the center of the conversation, not reacting to events.
Well, yeah, but it's also, and I'll point out, an age break on that too. A lot of older, especially Republicans, who remember the Cold War, who see the U.S.'s role as sort of beacon of democracy playing out across the world stage, and that more isolationist strain that you see from back to the top. Younger men for whom the appeal is pull back from everything from the world stage, and they see that message in their vote for Trump.
Anthony Salvanto, Ed O'Keefe, I very much appreciate juniors always accommodating for us here. We'll see you next week, folks. Thanks.